I wasn't looking for a weapon when I started researching the Mudflood. I was trying to understand a geological anomaly. Cities buried under meters of sediment, first floors converted to basements, entire architectural epochs submerged and forgotten. The standard explanation, when anyone bothers to offer one, points to natural disasters, gradual urban development, maybe localized flooding events spread across decades. But then I found the maps. Not modern reconstructions, not artistic interpretations, original survey maps from the 1850s and 1860s, military reconnaissance documents, municipal planning records from cities across 3 continents. And they all showed the same thing happening at the same time. Not gradually, not over centuries. Simultaneously, St. Petersburg buried under 3 meters of sediment between 1840 and 1850. Paris showing identical ground-level rise in the same decade. London, Boston, San Francisco, Melbourne. The dates cluster with impossible precision, all experiencing the same catastrophic burial within a 20-year window, all showing the same architectural evidence, basement windows that were ground floor entrances, doorways opening to compressed earth, street levels rising uniformly across entire metropolitan areas. That's not geology, that's not natural disaster, that's coordination. And that's when I started asking a different question. Not what happened, but what was done. Not disaster, but deployment. Not catastrophe, but weapon. The official narrative treats the Mudflood, when it acknowledges it at all, as either myth or misunderstood urban development. Gradual street raising, they say, normal construction practices, nothing unusual, nothing worth investigating. But here's what the official narrative can't explain. How do you raise street levels uniformly across a city of millions without any construction records? How do you bury 3-story buildings under sediment without any documentation of the earth being moved, the labor required, the engineering plans? How do you coordinate this across continents before telegraph systems were fully established, before any global communication infrastructure existed? You don't, unless someone else coordinated it, unless the burial wasn't accidental. The idea of a coordinated operation changes everything. I kept finding the same pattern in historical records, what few survived. Cities reporting strange atmospheric phenomena in the years immediately before the Mudflood events. Unusual cloud formations, electromagnetic disturbances, reports of the sky turning colors that shouldn't exist in nature. These weren't metaphors, these were observations recorded by multiple independent witnesses, sailors, farmers, municipal officials, all describing the same impossible atmospheric conditions. And then shortly after these phenomena, the mud. Not rain, not flooding, mud. Arriving from nowhere, falling from above in some accounts, rising from below in others, descriptions that make no sense if you're thinking about conventional disasters, but start to make terrible sense if you're thinking about something else entirely. A delivery system, a targeted deployment, a weapon designed to bury. Let me be clear about what I'm proposing, because it sounds absurd until you examine the evidence. What if the Mudflood wasn't a natural disaster at all? What if it was a technology, an atmospheric weapon capable of generating massive amounts of sediment and depositing it with precision across specific urban centers? What if someone possessed the capability to bury entire civilizations and did so deliberately? The question becomes, who were they burying? And that is where the giants become impossible to ignore. We have documented their existence in previous investigations. Photographic evidence from the 1800s shows individuals of extraordinary height, 8, 9, 10 feet tall. Not anomalies, not circus performers, but integrated members of society, guards, overseers, construction foremen, individuals photographed in front of buildings with doorways sized for their proportions, buildings we have been told were designed for aesthetic grandeur, but which suddenly make perfect functional sense when you place a 9-foot human in the frame. These beings existed, The photographic record proves it, the architectural evidence confirms it, and then, precisely when mudflood events cluster in the historical record, they vanish. Not gradually, not through documented decline. They simply stop appearing in photographs, in census records, in any form of documentation. The timing is too precise to be coincidental. The mudflood buries the buildings scaled for giants. The giants themselves disappear from history. And the civilization that built those impossible structures, the one we have been taught never existed, gets erased so thoroughly that questioning its existence invites ridicule. This raises a simple but critical question. If you wanted to eliminate a population, a specific category of human being with capabilities beyond normal, how would you do it? You could not use conventional warfare. Giants, if the accounts are accurate, would have had superior physical advantages, enhanced reach, and the ability to operate weapons and defenses at scales that would overwhelm normal human attackers. You would need something that did not require direct confrontation, something that could strike from a distance, and that could overwhelm through sheer volume rather than martial superiority. You would need a weapon that could bury them, literally and figuratively. And that's where the atmospheric technology becomes impossible to ignore. The Tartarian structures, the massive architectural complexes we have documented throughout this series, were not just buildings, they were machines. The ornate domes, the elaborate spires, the copper and metal fixtures positioned at specific heights and angles were not decorative, they were functional components of a system we no longer understand. A system designed to harness atmospheric electricity, to capture, store, and redistribute energy from the ionosphere itself. Free energy available to anyone with the knowledge to access it. And the buildings housing this technology were scaled for giants, operated by giants, maintained by the very beings who understood how to interface with systems built at their proportions. What if someone else wanted that technology? What if another power, another civilization, another faction possessing different capabilities but equal ambition decided that the giants and their atmospheric energy systems represented a threat? Or more likely, an opportunity. An opportunity that required removal of the current operators. You do not need to destroy the buildings if you can simply bury them deep enough that their original function becomes obscured. You do not need to dismantle the technology if you can eliminate everyone who knows how to operate it. You just need to reset the board. Bury the old world, rewrite the narrative, wait for memory to fade. And if you possess the same atmospheric technology the giants were using, if you understand the principles of ionospheric manipulation and electromagnetic frequency generation, you could weaponize it. You could reverse the process. Instead of drawing energy from the atmosphere, you could inject massive electromagnetic pulses designed to generate sediment precipitation, to literally manufacture mud on a scale sufficient to bury entire metropolitan areas. The evidence for atmospheric weapons appears in the strangest places. Patent records from the late 1800s and early 1900s describe devices for weather modification, for atmospheric electrical manipulation, for systems that sound like science fiction, except they are documented in official government archives. Many of these patents were classified shortly after submission. Many of the inventors died under circumstances that were never adequately explained. And many of the technologies described in these patents sound remarkably similar to the capabilities we have attributed to Tartarian architecture. Nikola Tesla spoke openly about atmospheric electricity, about free energy systems, about the possibility of transmitting power wirelessly through the ionosphere. He demonstrated technologies that conventional physics still struggles to explain. He warned repeatedly about the potential for these systems to be weaponized. What if his warnings came too late? What if the weaponization had already occurred? What if the Mudflood was the proof? I started mapping the Mudflood events against other historical disruptions Wars, famines, political upheavals, the collapse of governments, the correlation is disturbing. Almost every major mudflood burial event occurs in cities that were, at the time, centers of resistance to a specific emerging power structure. Cities that maintained independence, that refused certain economic arrangements, that held knowledge or technology that threatened the centralization of control. St. Petersburg, a center of imperial power, suddenly showed evidence of massive burial and reconstruction in the 1840s, precisely when political tensions between competing European factions reached crisis levels. Paris was buried and rebuilt during the same period when Napoleon III was consolidating power through extensive urban redesign, a redesign that happened impossibly fast, as if the ground itself had been recently disturbed and made ready for reconstruction. San Francisco shows severe mudflood evidence in the 1860s during the American Civil War, a conflict that was never just about slavery, but about which economic and technological systems would dominate the continent. The timing is not coincidental. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Target the cities, bury the infrastructure, eliminate the guardians, rewrite the history. The deeper I went into military records, the few that exist and have not been classified or destroyed, the more I found references to atmospheric research, to weather modification experiments, to classified projects investigating electromagnetic pulse generation. These projects cluster in the late 1800s and early 1900s, precisely the period when mudflood events were still being documented before the entire phenomenon was memory-holed from official history. This is where it gets uncomfortable. The technology apparently required for mudflood deployment, atmospheric electromagnetic manipulation, ionospheric pulse generation, and targeted sediment precipitation would require an understanding of physics that officially did not exist in the 1800s. It would require computational capabilities, energy generation systems, and coordination infrastructure that we are told were not developed until the mid-20th century at the earliest, unless it was inherited, unless someone found Tartarian technology intact, reverse-engineered it, and deployed it against its original operators, unless the mudflood was the giants' own weapon, turned against them by an enemy who understood just enough to weaponize it, but not enough to preserve its original beneficial purpose. That would explain the systematic burial. That would explain why Tartarian buildings survived, their functions obscured, but their structures intact. You do not destroy what you plan to study, to reverse engineer, to eventually claim as your own. You just bury it long enough that no one remembers who built it first. The photographic evidence of giants shows them frequently near construction sites, near large-scale infrastructure projects, and near buildings under construction or renovation. They are not laborers in the conventional sense, but overseers, technical operators, individuals whose presence seemed necessary for projects of unusual scale or complexity. What if their role was not just physical? What if they understood harmonic resonance, vibrational frequencies, and the use of sound and electromagnetic fields to manipulate matter at scales we consider impossible? What if the massive stone blocks we attribute to primitive construction techniques were actually moved using technology the giants operated, but we no longer comprehend? If such capabilities existed, and the architectural evidence suggests they did, then eliminating the giants would not just remove a physical threat, it would eliminate a knowledge base, a living library of operational expertise that could not be replaced through simple documentation. You can write down formulas, but you cannot easily transfer embodied knowledge, the kind that requires specific physical capabilities, specific sensory perceptions, specific scales of interaction. The mud did more than bury buildings, it buried the knowledge itself. I keep finding references in old newspapers, brief mentions that appeared once then were never followed up. Reports of unusual military experiments, of government facilities conducting atmospheric research, of unexplained phenomena occurring shortly before mudflood events. One account from a Nebraska newspaper in 1867 describes strange lights in the sky, geometric patterns that lasted for hours, followed by what residents called black rain, a substance that fell like water but left thick sediment deposits that took months to clear. Black rain. These accounts were dismissed at the time as frontier exaggeration, as misidentified natural phenomena, but the pattern repeats. Similar descriptions come from Russia, South America, and Southeast Asia, all describing the same impossible atmospheric conditions, all shortly before historical records show evidence of rapid ground-level rise, of buildings being buried, of urban landscapes being fundamentally altered. Pattern. What haunts me most is not the weapon itself, it is the coordination, because if this was deployed deliberately, if the Mudflood was a targeted elimination event, then whoever controlled it had global reach. They had the resources to deploy it across continents, the organizational structure to coordinate its use with political and military objectives, and the power to ensure that knowledge of its existence was systematically erased from official history. Coordination. That level of coordination requires something that officially did not exist in the 1800s. A global power structure, a shadow authority, an organization capable of rewriting history on a planetary scale. Shadow authority. The evidence for such an organization exists in fragments. Financial records showing impossible capital flows between banks that supposedly operated independently. Military communications referencing coordinated actions that had no official authorization. Treaty agreements that make no sense unless you assume a third party, never named, orchestrating outcomes from behind-the-scenes evidence. And always the same pattern of missing records. Documents that should exist but do not. Archives that were destroyed in fires that occurred at suspiciously convenient moments. Testimony that was recorded then lost. Physical evidence that was collected for study, then simply disappeared. Missing records, not accident, not neglect. Deliberate suppression, deliberate. The giants knew, they knew what was coming. The evidence suggests they tried to preserve something. We find time capsules, sealed vaults, structures built with obvious defensive purposes that still managed to be buried, as if the builders knew atmospheric attack was possible, but underestimated its scale, as if they prepared for siege, but not for burial. Giants. Some of the vaults we have documented beneath modern cities contain strange artifacts. Devices that look like instruments but whose purpose remains unclear. Mechanisms of brass and copper and materials we still cannot identify. Components that seem designed for atmospheric interface, for electromagnetic manipulation, for purposes that would make sense if you understood the physics of free energy systems, but remain mysterious from a conventional scientific perspective. Artifacts. These artifacts are rarely studied. When discovered during construction or renovation, they are typically catalogued as industrial equipment from unknown manufacturers and stored in museum basements where they gather dust and never get displayed. Or they are purchased by private collectors and vanish into personal collections that are never accessible to researchers. Vanish. The pattern is too consistent to be accidental. Someone does not want these artifacts studied. Someone does not want the questions they raise to be asked. Someone is blocking access. Those questions lead inevitably to uncomfortable conclusions about who possessed advanced technology in the 1800s, how that technology was used, and what happened to the civilization that created it. The Mudflood was not the end of the war. It was the beginning of the cover-up. Once you have buried the evidence, once you have eliminated the witnesses, once you have rewritten the historical record, you still have to maintain the narrative. You have to ensure that new discoveries do not contradict the official story. You have to suppress research that points in dangerous directions. You have to make certain questions unaskable. And that is exactly what we see. Academic institutions refuse to investigate mudflood evidence. Historical societies dismiss photographic proof of giants as hoaxes without conducting proper forensic analysis. Archaeological departments lose funding when their research strays too close to forbidden conclusions. The mechanisms of suppression are not crude, they are sophisticated, they are institutional, they operate through peer pressure, through funding allocation, and through publication gatekeeping. They operate through the quiet understanding that certain careers end when certain questions get asked too loudly. This is not conspiracy in the sense of a secret cabal meeting in dark rooms. This is structural suppression. This is how power protects uncomfortable truths by making their investigation professionally suicidal, academically disrespectable, and culturally ridiculous. But the evidence persists. The buried first floors remain. The oversized doorways still stand. The photographs of giants exist in archives that have not been fully purged. Newspaper accounts of atmospheric phenomena survive in microfilm collections. Vaults beneath modern cities still contain artifacts that do not make sense, and the questions remain unanswered. Not because they cannot be answered, but because answering them would require acknowledging that everything we have been taught about recent history is incomplete at best, deliberately falsified at worst. What was the mudflood? Not a disaster, a deployment. Not geology, technology, not natural, manufactured. Why were the giants targeted? Because they understood systems we were meant to forget. Because they operated technology we were meant to inherit without comprehension. Because they represented a link to a civilization that had to be erased for the current power structure to claim legitimacy. Who possessed this weapon? That is the question that keeps me up at night. Whoever could deploy atmospheric manipulation technology on a global scale in the 1800s, whoever could coordinate burial events across continents, whoever could systematically erase a category of human being from history and make it stick, that power did not disappear. It evolved, it adapted, it learned to operate more subtly, and it is still here. The buildings remember, even if we do not. The buried ground floors testify. The oversized doorways stand as monuments to beings who no longer exist. The evidence persists, waiting for someone willing to see it, to connect it, to ask the questions that everyone else has agreed not to ask. The mudflood was a weapon. The giants were its targets. And the civilization we inherited is built on the buried remains of something we were never meant to remember. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And once you understand what was done, you have to ask what else might have been erased. What other truths lie buried under meters of manufactured sediment and centuries of deliberate forgetting? The weapon still exists. The knowledge of how to deploy it has not been lost. And the power structure that used it once has every reason to use it again if the buried past threatens to surface. What do you think happened? Have you noticed these patterns in your own cities? Share your thoughts, but be aware the algorithm does not want this discussed. The giants are gone. The weapon that destroyed them remains, and we are left asking the simplest, most essential question: what else do we not remember? And why were we taught to forget? Do not forget to subscribe.